Despite how generally well liked the two games in the Evil Within series are, I never really see much of anything about them. And I feel like this was still the case back in late 2017 when the Evil Within 2 first released. I personally didn't even play the games at all until 2019, even though I owned the first game for years beforehand. And I've got to say that while both the games have their own flaws, I feel like they work really well together as a series. The original Evil Within is pretty linear, third person, and it's a pretty typical survival horror experience. It draws on a lot of psychological themes, and overall, it's got a pretty unsettling feeling to it for most of the playtime. But as for story, I'd say it's pretty average. I honestly don't remember much of it, and that's why I'm not going to go into too much detail. But it wasn't overbearing, there wasn't too much dialogue. If anything, there might have been not enough because I don't remember that much of it. But honestly, the story is second fiddle to the gameplay in this instance, so while some people may really enjoy it, I think it's not that consequential. This game really shines in its atmosphere and the gameplay. The atmosphere of the world is just awful, and I mean that in a good way. There's tons of creatures that terrorize you, everything's so bleak and depressing, and when that blends together with the gameplay of managing ammo and resources, the game really starts to work well. To top it all off, the game has 3 really good DLCs. The first 2 focus on one of the side characters, Kidman, and it's really similar to the main game, but it has a bigger focus on stealth. Honestly, it's a lot creepier than the main game, which is why it's my favorite part of the game. And I really love that the hard mode just makes everything pitch black, and you have to rely on your flashlight to move around it all. And then the last DLC is a first-person boss rush style thing where you play as one of the main enemies from the original story, and it's pretty good. I don't think it's as good as the other parts of the game, but it's entertaining, so I think it was worth putting in. All in all, I think the first game's really good. If I were to give it like a 1 out of 10 rating, I'd probably give it like an 8. It's really fun. It can get repetitive, that's why it's not a perfect 10, but overall, in the genre of survival horror games, I'd say it's way up there compared to the abundance of not so great games that you would often see when looking at a similar selection. But that brings me to the sequel. And to put it simply, it really subverted my expectations after playing the first game. It begins in a really similar linear fashion, and honestly, it's a much creepier beginning than the first game. And this beginning part really builds up an expectation that you should be on edge at all times. But at least for me, that was not really the case. Don't get me wrong, the game is pretty good, but the beginning of the game really sets up an expectation that is very quickly changed within a few minutes of getting into the actual gameplay. The really eerie and almost haunted feeling of this beginning area of the game really kind of unsettled me, and I thought that the whole game was going to have this really creepy vibe to it. And while the game does maintain a creepy feeling, it changes when you get to the town where the actual gameplay begins. At that point, the game shows its true colors, so to say. You get a map of the world, you learn that you can do side quests, and the biggest deal is that it's open world. This is a big departure from the linear level style gameplay of the first game. And while it's pretty jarring at first, at least coming from the first game, it honestly was a really good decision. Being able to completely explore this new world with your main objective being the main story, clearly, but also having side objectives to get better weapons, more materials, it really gives you free reign over how you want to play the game. But with this, there is somewhat of a sacrifice of the creepiness that was pretty constant in the first game, with it being not as scripted, but that's made up with optional events that you can experience by going into optional buildings, looking in different spaces that not everyone will see, but it's there if you're really looking for it. So with that being said, I'd say the gameplay works a lot better in the sequel, but it isn't quite as scary of a game, at least in my perspective. So I'd say both of these games balance out. They both have very different aspects to them, but they both have very positive aspects with pretty little downside to both of them. So the main reason I went through saying all that is because I wish more game series would take risks like this, change things up, but do so in a way that it still is semblant of its predecessor. Sequels don't always have to be so much better than the original games. especially when the original games are really good. But you don't want to get stagnant by pumping out the same game over and over just with a different story in different locations. I feel like The Evil Within did this as good as they possibly could and showed that you can make a series, even if it's only 2 games, and not have to fall back on the tropes and repetitive nature of your past games. Unfortunately, it's been quite a few years since The Evil Within 2 came out, and there still hasn't been an announcement for a third installment, so hope's a little low on that actually happening. But Microsoft recently bought ZeniMax, the publisher of this game, or parent company, I should say, so maybe they'll do something with it. But even if they don't, I think this series will go down as a really successful one. Maybe not the most well known or popular, but it did what it wanted to do, and it turned out being a really good series.